So here we go. Tonight, week number 3. Again, we covered sight. We covered the nose of the wine. And I remember I said to you in week 2, I said, part 2, the nose is probably, one of the most important parts of tasting wine, because your nose gives you an insight on many different things. You walk into a restaurant, and you smell the food that's being cooked, or you're walking along the street and you can smell the freshly baked bread if you're passing by a bakery. So when it comes to wine, when you open the wine and you pour some in a glass, oftentimes for the wine, if it gets close to your nose, you can smell the wine. And then when it gets close to your nose, if there's a fault or something not right in that wine, the nose is going to tell you. No one knows what the nose knows, and the nose will know. Okay, so again, that's probably one of the most important parts of the wine tasting. And I consider this next part the tongue, or the taste part. This is the second most important part of wine tasting, or how to taste wine, because your taste buds, we say this: what we smell should be what we taste and more. But if it's a funky smell, you're not going to even waste your time tasting it. However, there are some foods out here now that has a pretty off-putting smell, but the taste is quite delicious. I'll let you do the research on that yourself. But for all intents and purposes, the nose gives you a preamp or a preview of what you're going to be tasting. So now let's go a little bit further than that. I got my notes right here, so that I can go through, and I uploaded the notes. And funny thing, I was having so much fun on several different platforms that I just uploaded the notes for tonight's broadcast. Whew! I got lucky on that one because I almost missed out. So now, glasses on, glasses off. Glasses on for me. So here we go. Let me get one more sip of wine here, and we go through it. So when we go through, we're tasting wine. Here's what's happening. We're trying to determine, A, whether we like it or not. Just to make it real simple, whether we like the wine or not. B, we're trying to determine if that wine is in balance. And I'll go into more detail about that as we move along. And then C, we're trying to determine if there's any off taste in the wine. Off taste can be, any multiple of things. It can be a vinegar taste. It can be a over sulfuric taste. Where we're talking about, egg. I mean, it can be just even though earthy or composty can be a component of wine, but sometimes it can be like over the top, which means there's something else going on in that wine. There's a bacterial reaction happening in that wine that's taking it way over the top, that completely overtakes the natural taste of the wine. So when we're tasting wine, we're trying to determine those simple things. And I said, and the most simple thing of all, straight up my tie, the most simple thing of all is whether or not we like the wine. So now we did our visual, okay? We did our smell. We took our notes on what we smelled, okay? And from taking the notes, we now move into the taste. And when I taste wine, for me, it's a 2-step process. And it's a 2-step process that I deem to be, it should be a standard. And most of us that are tasting wine or experienced with tasting wine, we know that this is the standard for us when tasting wine. 2 steps. Your first step is this. Your first step is a rinse. So I may have had, some crazy flavored foods or some crazy sweet foods or something like that, and I may have taken a bit of bread thinking it's going to, take care of all of the crazy flavors I had on my palate. But then I'm going to go to the wine. The wine is going to know that, hey, you just brushed your teeth, or you gargled with mouthwash, or you just had a Twinkie or something. The wine is going to know, because it's going to tell you right away, especially if it's a dry wine. And then oftentimes if it's a sweeter style wine, if what you have was much sweeter than the wine's going to tell you, yo, hey, we gotta start this over again. So here we go. So the first step is going to be, I like to call a palate rinse. All right, here we go. Now, I like to rinse my palate for about 12 to 15 seconds. And you either spit or swallow. The choice is yours, depending on where you are and what you're doing. But I'm swallowing in this case. I'm not going to spit it out. This is the only wine I'm having tonight. I'm not doing a panel of wines. It's just one wine, so it's okay. So what I'm doing is I'm cleansing my palate of anything else that may interfere with the wine that I'm going to be tasting this evening. And so at that moment, you actually get a taste of the wine. But I don't want to judge the wine simply on that taste. This is just initial taste to say, hey, something was off, or hey, wow, that's interesting. But most importantly, again, it's to rinse my palate. When I talk about rinsing my palate, let me just clarify that. It's just not rinsing my palate. You saw that I was swishing. I swished the wine throughout my gums. I want my entire mouth to be cleansed with the wine that I'm going to be evaluating, that I'm going to be tasting. Now, so that's the first sip. Now for the second sip, the most important sip, is when you sip the wine, taste the wine, and immediately write down. Okay? So here we go. Wow. So at that point, it's like, okay, right. So I tell you this, I had the acidity when I just did my first sip, which is the rinse. The acidity is still there. Tannins are there, but tannins are very smooth. So we're talking about medium tannins, short to medium tannins. It's very well blended in with the wine, probably due in part to its age. The acidity is still, it's moderate. It's not like crazy, but it's moderate. The fruit quality is well blended. I mean, basically for this particular wine here, everything is blended in together, and that brings us into balance. Let's talk about balance. Okay, in the wine, we're talking about components. There are four principal or major components in wine, and those principal would be tannins, alcohol, acidity, and sweetness. So that's tannin, alcohol, acidity, and sweetness. What you're tasting for, and the reason why we're taking that wine, we're spreading it all over our palate, our tongue, and we're spreading it all over our mouth, is to determine if that wine is balanced. But before we even go that far, let's talk about the tongue. Now, if you download the sheet, you can look along with the sheet. So I'm gonna just talk it through. All right. So our tongue, and everyone's tongue, our palate, is going to be different. Okay. We have different shaped tongues. We have different amounts of probably taste buds on our tongue. So many different, differences in our tongue, our palate. But typically speaking, even though we have a tongue that has taste buds, pretty much all over, you can taste the wine all over, but then there's principal spots where certain flavors or certain aspects of flavors will be more enhanced, like the tip of the tongue. Tip of the tongue is going to give you more of the sweetness, all right? The sides of the tongue, right here, so the tip, sweet, sides here, okay? We're talking about more of the salt taste or mineral taste. Towards the back, here, we're talking about more of the sour taste. And then way towards the back, we have those big, giant taste buds sticking out. That's where we get more of the bitter characteristics. So when we are, and in fact, that corresponds into something else we're going to do next. But what we're doing, when we rinse the palate, we want to make sure that wine is not only incorporated or rinsed throughout our mouth, but also it covers all of our palate. Because the only way to determine what is balanced for us is for the wine to cover our entire palate. And what I mean by that is when you take that sip of the wine and you do your rinse over your palate, and now you want to test for balance, the components, what were the components again? Say it with me. Alcohol, acidity, sweetness, and tannins. What we're saying is none of these should spike. It should be in balance. Okay? So alcohol, we know what alcohol is. Sweetness, we know what sweetness is. It's just the presence of sugar. We know what sweetness is. Tannins. All right. Acidity, we understand acidity when we think about lemons. Tannins, excuse me, is something that most people are not familiar with. Most people call tannins that dry. They call it dry. Okay, but tannins actually is something completely separate. Tannins, if you think about that tactile feel that you get in your mouth, or more importantly, let's see, I got a little shaking going on the camera here, so let's watch that and make sure I'm not too close to the table. So the tannins will be that tactile feeling that you get on your palate, or you can maybe think about, when you go to the dentist and they stuff your mouth full of cotton and you feel like your gums are sticking to your teeth, that's tannins. Or when you drink an unsweetened tea, that's tannins. That stickiness that you get stick to your gums. And that's one indication. Again, when you get the whole palate, the whole mouth rinse, then you get the feel for all of those different components. All right? So now the goal is, when you do that, is to say, is this wine in balance? When I take the wine into my mouth, like so, and it spreads across my palate, is it in balance? Do I taste more acidity? Do I taste more tannins? Do I taste more sweetness? If it's a dry wine, I like to equate it more to fruit, not necessarily sweet. Do I taste the fruitiness? Is one thing out of whack? For this particular wine here, for my palate, here's the clause. Wine tasting is subjective because everyone's palate is going to be different. Everyone's going to feel, everyone's going to taste, everyone's going to think differently about a wine. That's the wine clause. Now that that's over, for my palate, in this particular wine that I'm doing this evening, it was nicely balanced. Nothing stands out for my palate in tasting this wine. So that's what we mean by balance. So when you're tasting your wine, and if you're watching this video now, I would love to see your comments. Or if you watch the replay and you're doing this exercise, I would love to see your comments on what it was for when you're tasting your wine. Okay? So now, when we talk about alcohol, alcohol is a natural occurrence that happens in wine because we have yeast. If you ever bake bread, you know how the whole thing goes. You got your yeast, you got your sugar, and the yeast is just chomping on the sugar's fighting back, but the sugar's losing, and they release this gas, and there's conversion going on, and we have alcohol. It's funny, when I bake bread, I always smell the alcohol. So that yeast is doing this job. I remember using too much sugar. Who knows? But so that's what happens when we talk about alcohol. Then we start beginning to talk about acidity. Acidity, is a natural occurrence in fruit in general. But when it comes to wine, there's lots of different types of acidity that exist, in wine baking. But we're going to talk about three principal ones. We're going to talk about citric acid. We're going to talk about malic acid. We're going to talk about tartaric acid. Now, here's a simple way to equate or think about when it comes to the three, I like to say, primary principal acids when it comes to wine. Citric acid, all right? Sharp, sour, bitter. Lemon, okay? When you bite into a lemon, you get that woo and so sharp, sour, bitterness, because it hits you right here. Lemon hits you right here. Every single time it hits you right here, and you're like, oh my God, all right? So now, the malic acid would be the tartness that you feel. So think about when you bite into a Granny Smith apple. That first non-sweetness you feel, sensation you feel in your palate is the tartness before it gets way back here. Again, that's taking place sort of like in the mid part of the palate. And then we have the tartaric acid, sour. Well, we all know sour. I mean, how many people out there love sour candies? So we all know what sour is like, okay? All right, so now we take these acids and we try to get a feel. When all the acids are comprised or are mixed in together, we pretty much think about simple things. We think about bitter and tart, are the simple things we equate acidity to: bitter and tart. And it's okay to be that simple. Again, I'm giving this information so you could do more research, so you can have more information. Then you can learn more, know more when you're tasting wine. But it's just that simple. You know, because those things we identify simply with, in tasting anything, we identify with simple flavors: sweet, salt, bitter, sour. You know, and the bitter and sour, you know, kind of falls in the realm of acidity. It's that simple, and that's wine, just like eating. So now, when we talk about sweetness, I like to take sweetness. You know, you heard me mention earlier with my particular wine, red wine here, which I'm empty. Let me pour some more here. With my particular red wine here, that was dry, and I said, well, I can't really talk about sweetness because it is a very dry wine, but I can talk about sweetness. I like to take sweetness and break it into a couple different categories. I like to go sweet sugar, and sweet as in flavorful fruit, even though it's dry, but it has a fruit quality that's there, which gives you the idea that there's a hint of sweetness there. Okay, and it still may be some residual sugar, but not enough to make you think, oh, I'm chomping on, you know, some sugar syrup or something. Okay, so I like to break it down in two different categories. I'm drinking a sweet wine or a semi-sweet wine, and I want to look for that presence of sweetness and find out how well that balances with the overall aspect of wine. If it's a dry wine, then I want to switch from that sweetness, and I want to think about the fruit characteristics, because if I'm not tasting fruit, even though it's a dry wine, if I'm not tasting fruit, I can care less about it being barrel aged. I can care less about if it blended with something else. If I can't taste the fruit in a dry wine, even though there's no sweetness, it's like, you know, when you taste the lemon or you taste the orange, it's not sweet, even though you get that bitter tartness, sourness thing going on here. But once you bite into the little, you know, pulps, the little pieces of fruit, you get that slight burst of the fruitiness, even though the overall fruit itself is going to be tart. It's going to be underripe. Okay? So when I'm drinking a dry wine, I look for that fruity quality because it is a root. So again, sweetness for me is two categories. One, the presence of sugar. Two, the presence of the natural flavor of the fruit. Okay? And that's breaking down the components. So before, I'll say this first. There's a process. Here's some like side notes. So sidebar or side notes, malolactic fermentation or mallow. This is a secondary fermentation. So winemaking goes through a process. It goes to this first primary fermentation. You know, the yeast is going through and doing its thing, you know, and then we get those strong acid characteristics to soften out the acid. I don't know if you ever have the chance to, if you know someone that owns a winery or runs a winery or someone that makes wine, you know, take the opportunity to taste that wine in different stages. Taste the juice freshly squeezed. Taste the juice after primary fermentation. And if they do a secondary, which is called malolactic fermentation, taste the juice again. So you can get a true idea of what is meant by what happens with the acidity. So mallow secondary fermentation softens, there you go. It softens the acidity. It softens more of that tartness, that strong sour bitterness. It kind of smooths it out, just like, you know, like a lactic acid. It makes it very smooth. Okay. So now another piece of note, we're going to talk about climates and how, and what role climate plays. So, you know, oftentimes you hear, you know, about, you know, this comes from this part of the world, or this comes from this part of the world, or this part of the country, or this part of the state. You know, every state has a different climate. Every country has a different climate, and within every country or every state or every region, you know, there may be a little microclimate, you know, so it may be like, you know, 40 degrees right here, but then it's going to be in the same region, there's going to be like 45, 50 degrees here. You know, then you break it down for the microclimate inside of the vineyard itself. You know, I think when I had a vineyard, I had, it was up a sloping hill, southwestern facing hill, and it was sloping. So the thing was interesting because I had four quadrants in it, and each quadrant, it was a 5-degree difference in temperature. Okay, so my little small simple vineyard had microclimates, and believe it or not, it affected the way the ripening of the fruit. Okay, so now back to climate. If it's going to be a warmer climate, okay, warmer climate, hot, low acidity. Because if it's warmer, things are going to ripen better. All right? It's going to produce more sugar. So, low acidity. If it's a cooler climate, that means it's not going to ripen as much. So that means what? More acidity. So now you can understand Wisconsin wines, you know. And acidity, don't be turned off by acidity. Acidity gives you that nice, refreshing, mouth-watering feel, which is what I look for no matter where the wine comes from, warm or cool climate. I want that refreshing, mouth-watering sensation in my mouth to know that I'm drinking a fruit, okay? So, again, what did I say? Warmer, hotter climate, low acidity. Cooler climate, higher acidity. And the objective of the vineyard manager is no matter what the climate is, no matter where you are, is to bring that balance. And then that balance hopefully transitions into the winemaking processes, which again transitions into the finished product of the wine itself. It's finding that balance. So now you get the whole big picture, right? Body and weight when you're tasting wine. Body and weight. Now, you hear that term a lot. What is the body or the weight of the wine? We're not talking about measurements, you know. This wine weighs, you know, maybe 0.68 grams on my palate. No, that's not what we mean. That's not what is meant when we talk about body and weight. What we're talking about is the mouthfeel. You know, is it a light wine? Is it a medium-bodied wine? Is it a heavy, robust, full-bodied wine? Well, how do you determine that? Well, kind of simple. Many of us by now have had the opportunity to consume whole milk. And many of us have probably consumed half and half. We drink half and half with our coffee all the time. But have you ever had half and half on its own? Many of us have consumed 2%. Some of us have consumed or are probably drinking now skim milk. So let's just break it down. Skim milk. 2%, full milk. 3 different sensations of body, okay? The skim milk is, we know, it's almost like drinking water. It's like, you know, colored water. The 2% is somewhere in between the full milk and the whole. It's not as light as the skim, but it's not as dense as the full milk. So that's what is meant when we're talking about wine, okay? When you take the wine into your mouth, and it's rolling across your palate and you swallow, what is the body or the weight of the wine? Is it a lighter wine? A lighter wine would be almost like drinking water. There's many white wines and red wines, you know, that it just slides right over the mouth, right over the palate. You know, it's a lighter wine. You have some wines that you get this like slight weightiness on the palate, you know, just very subtle. You know, so your tongue is very sensitive to so many different things. You know, this is where it comes into paying close attention. We're at 31 minutes. We're on a roll now, but this is where it comes into paying close attention to what your natural body senses are telling you. So your palate, you know, even though it has that acute sense of taste, it also has a very acute sense of weight when it comes to liquids. And the last thing, again, when we're tasting wine, is it full body? Does it have like a full weightiness? So I'm going to taste this one, and the alcohol plays into that too. Okay, alcohol. If it's alcohol, this is interesting here. Alcohol and sugar plays into that weightiness of wine. And those who have studied chemistry, you know, would know more about this. You can explain it to everybody else. But alcohol and sugar has a play in that. So we're taking a wine, let's say we have a wine that probably has 12% alcohol. But in that 12% alcohol, it probably has a higher percentage of residual sugar, making it a sweeter wine. Now, if you ever drank or sampled a sugar syrup, if you made sugar syrup, you make one sugar syrup that's 1-to-1, 1 part water, 1 part sugar. Another sugar syrup that's 1 part water, half sugar, and so on. You'll get the difference of the weight in the feel because of the sugar. Alcohol is the same thing. Alcohol is like a counterbalance thing going here. So you may have a lighter alcohol, but you may have more sugar. It's going to make it seem a little bit heavier. You may have a full alcohol, like 14% alcohol and less sugar, but if everything else is in balance, it can seem like much lighter. You think of 14% alcohol, oh my God, that's a big wine. But it can be very, very light on the palate if there's a good presence of acidity and the other components are in balance. Okay, so you play around with that on your palate, and you have to determine that for yourself. Okay, again, here's the clause. Everyone's palate is going to be different. Everyone's perspective will be different. Everyone's taste and opinion will be different. Thereby, tasting wine is and will always be subjective. You can't, I repeat, you can't be wrong. It's what you taste. Okay? All right, so now, my wine here is not as chewy, but it's not light. I would give this like again, we lost a lot of sediment. The grapes in here is Tempranillo, Cabernet, Merlot, all, pretty full-bodied grapes grown in Spain, where it's pretty warm, pretty hot. So we're going to get like, very ripe fruit. But because of it being 12 years old, some of the sediment drop, this quality, this a little bit lighter, a little bit more finesse to it. So this is like maybe like medium plus. You can't go medium plus plus or medium plus 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 plus. This is more like medium plus. Okay, so this is more like a medium bodied wine. Now that we covered that, all right, we covered the tasting process, we covered the components. I have this experiment. Also inside the notes, we had a thing of, I said get 3 glasses. Okay, 3 glasses, use water. I have black tea in the bottom of my glass because I wanted to figure out some way to emulate tannins, using tea will emulate tannins. And then I have, in 2 separate containers, I have one, which is my sugar syrup, okay? And I have a half a teaspoon. I have the other, which is my lemon, and again, a half a teaspoon. And again, with this little mad scientist kit here, we're going to play with the wine and figure out what our balance is going to be when it comes to wine. All right, so whether you're using water or using tea, it's entirely up to you. We're going to try to figure out what that balance is going to be. So I already tasted the tea by itself. I know what the tea tastes like by itself. I know the astringency that it has on my palate. So I'm going to add, I want to put some acidity. Now, in tea, in most herbal teas, there's some citric acid that could be added to it or it's just naturally part of it. So I'm going to add I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon, half of a half of lemon juice in the first one. I'm going to add a half a teaspoon in the second one. I'm going to go 50-50. A teaspoon and a teaspoon. So the teaspoon of the tea and a teaspoon of lemon juice. Okay? Stir. Stir, stir. And what we're doing here, this exercise here is helping you determine what your tolerances are when it comes to some of the components in wine. Of course, I don't have alcohol in here, so we're doing everything but alcohol. So here is the 1/4 teaspoon and a teaspoon of tea. Okay, now for my palate, okay, then you got to do the palate rinse too. Here we go. Let's do it right. And let that spread. I got the taste of the tea. Now it's funny because it's not that strong. I taste the citrus. I taste the slight tartness and the subtle bitterness. But to me, from my palate, that's pretty balanced. So this was 1 tablespoon of the black tea and a 1/4 teaspoon of the lemon juice. No sweetness yet. Here is half a teaspoon of tea and a half a teaspoon of lemon juice. Wow, that's a lot more intense. You get the difference. So if you're doing this exercise now, you can kind of get it. If you do it later, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. I'm more on this scale, okay? Now we're going to do 1-to-1. a teaspoon of tea and a teaspoon of the lemon juice. Whoa! So we have both tannins and acidity just kicking in on that one. Okay, so now you get the balance. Now we have our sugar. How can we bring this in the balance? I'm gonna do the same measurements for the sugar. I'm gonna go a quarter of a teaspoon of sugar in the first one, a half a teaspoon in the second one, and a teaspoon in the third one. I mean, you could do whatever variation you want because your goal is try to find out what your tolerances are when it comes to sweetness, acidity, and astringency or tannin when it comes to wine. So here we go. The first one again. A teaspoon of the tea, that's our tannin. We have a quarter of a teaspoon of both sugar and lemon juice, acid and sweetness. That's the sugar syrup, okay? The sugar syrup I have set up is 1:1. 1 part water, 1 part sugar. Here we go. And still, for me, and that may even be, it's balanced for me. I would probably even do a little bit more acidity to that one. But we'll see what happens because there's more acidity in the second one, okay? But a half a teaspoon of the sugar syrup. Let's see what happens. It's amazing. So that's what this, it's balanced but slightly a little bit sweet. My, did that change for my palate? Remember earlier when it was just the tea and the lemon juice, that was pretty balanced for my palate. With the tea, 1 teaspoon, the half a teaspoon of the lemon juice and half a teaspoon of the sugar syrup, now my balance is right here in the middle. It's amazing how this plays out when you play this little game. Now I'm going to go for the goal. Remember earlier, this is just like out the box for me. So I have in here a teaspoon of each. Okay, so this is like equal across the board. Here we go. And that's not bad either. Now, because there's more sugar syrup in here, now we go into body. There's a lot more body in this last one, but it's not as crazy tart as it was earlier before I added the sugar syrup. Look how fun that was. I want you too to also do this exercise, have fun, enjoy it. Try this exercise with your friends and see where their tolerance lies when it comes to sweetness and tartness or acidity in wine. So I hope that you learned something more from these exercises, something more from this video. We have 41 minutes. I mean, this is going to be a lot of fun. I was looking forward to it. You know, I couldn't wait to get to part 3. You know, so I hope that you found something of interest in here.